Imagine running a business today with no visibility into your revenue, finances, workforce, or overall performance. You'd never really know what problems you have or what changes or investments you need to make. Our federal government is kind of like that right now. The tried and true data that has guided fiscal, legislative, and market policies in America for generations are showing enormous cracks. A massive economy that's increasingly complex is hard to understand in the best of times. We've made it far worse by systematically handcuffing our statistics agencies with reduced funding and personnel. It's all led to a very squishy understanding of the job market, inflation, GDP, and much more. Numbers released today can be subject to wild revisions a month or two later. Politicians and their tribes can therefore find numbers to support whatever agenda they want. I dissected this problem with our guest today, Ed Elson, best known for his role as the co-host of the Prof G Markets podcast and his fast-growing Substack, Simply Put. We talked about the dangers of unreliable economic data and the challenges it creates for business leaders and policymakers. We delved into the cultural implications too, the lack of shared and trusted ground truth, and what Ed refers to as, quote, the death of centralized conversation. We also talked about the discord between the market enthusiasm for AI and the disdain for AI held by the majority of rank-and-file Americans. Finally, we bantered about our acumen, or lack thereof, for basic home repairs, whether we're ready to host guests at a moment's notice, and being judged by bartenders for the drinks we order. So get ready to talk numbers with Ed Elson, and me, the dumbest guy in the room. Ed Elson, it's great to see you. Where are you joining us from today?
Good to see you. I'm joining you from New York. I'm here in the studio on Wall Street, Broad Street technically. Another day.
You're getting the same rain we're getting here in Pennsylvania, I suspect.
That's right. Very rainy day. Stay inside all day.
But warmer.
Read the news.
Warmer,
yeah. But warmer.
Yeah,
yes.
But warmer.
Very true.
We've been pen pals now for a few years. I don't think we've ever even talked virtually before, so it's great to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. We seem to share an exasperation over some of the kind of the garbage data that we see floating around out there, economic, government, and otherwise. And so before we proceed to shit on all of that, which I certainly plan to do, I know you probably get asked this. I get asked this question a lot. Like, what do you read? Who do you follow? Blah blah blah. I'm going to ask you a little bit differently. What data sources? And your answer can't be civic science, although I hope it's one of them. What data do what resources do you rely on for numbers? What do you trust? What are some of your go-tos?
I try to go for the basics. I mean, I trust anything that comes out of the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the information. I mean, that's where if I see a number in there, I try to trust it as a general rule. So that's what I'm reading for that data. In terms of survey data, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Gallup. I'm a huge fan of Pew Research. I think that the questions that those guys are asking are really great. And I also have to tell you, I'm a fan of the questions that you guys are asking too in your survey data. So, I mean, it's a broad range of data. I'm also someone who actually does trust government data in general. I mean, a lot of people say it's compromised. I mean, if you were a Republican during the Biden administration, you'd say, all the BLS data is fake, or when the numbers are too good, it's not real, or it's a psyop, or whatever. And now we see that the Democrats say the same thing about the Trump administration right now. I'm not someone who subscribes to that view. If you're going to tell me that the government data is wrong, I need to see very, very clear and hard evidence. And that doesn't mean that the government can't be wrong with its data. It just means that I'm not someone who believes that the government is lying when they tell us numbers, or at least if they are, show me, give me the evidence, show me the proof. So I trust government data too. And I think ultimately great data, this isn't quite your question, but I think great data for me at this point is a function of great questions. The best data collectors and providers, one, you need to make sure that you're getting a big sample size and you're doing it right. I think most people know the rules for that at this point. But two, you need to be asking the right questions. And the surveyors that I enjoy, I think, as I said, I think Gallup asks great questions, so does Pew Research, so does Civic Science. But that's a big piece of what distinguishes good data versus bad data.
Two things I want to comment on. First, we're big fans of Pew here. They are kind of the gold standard we hold ourselves to in terms of the rigor that they put into their research. The space we try to fill, because of their methodology, which is tried and true over many years, speed is not one of their things, right?
Right.
We're trying to bring that sort of same level of rigor to the speed element and the more kind of always on nature of research. So big Pew fans. I love you gave an answer that I always give when I talk about the resources I rely on, which is the Financial Times and Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, because I always tell my friends, I want to read what the people on Wall Street are reading because they're making really, really big bets on that information. And if that information's wrong, right, they're not going to subscribe to those outlets any longer. So Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, they've got to leave their biases at the door, because if they lose their credibility with their readers, they have no business. And so I think we're very, very well aligned there. I do want to come back to the government data though for a minute. I don't necessarily, first of all, I agree with you that there's not necessarily some deep state, whatever psyop thing going on and the numbers are being fudged. But you can't ignore the frequency with which, and in some cases, the dramatic nature with which those numbers are revised from one period of time to another.
Yes.
And it begs a question of whether, and this isn't rhetorical, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. What's the point of the government releasing those numbers, knowing how incomplete they are? And would we be better served waiting until they're complete than to get these sort of, quick dips of numbers that have a tendency to move the market and change public sentiment when we know like a quarter later they could be completely different?
The revisions are a huge problem. And just for anyone listening who's wondering, like, what are you even talking about? We have this issue that is actually becoming worse and worse in the government right now. And this isn't just a Trump thing. This was also true during Biden's administration too.
For decades.
It's been true for a long time, where the numbers will come out. We'll hear that, we added this many jobs to the economy. And then in the revision, when we come back to it 6 months later, 12 months later, and hear about what the real number is now that we have more information, the revision is gigantic. And it'll say, actually, we didn't add 100,000 jobs. We added 10,000 jobs. Or in some cases, we actually lost 50,000 jobs. And this is something that has been happening for a while, because collecting data and understanding numbers is a difficult thing. It's also, it's not as simple as just count up all the numbers and then that's your answer. They have to do a lot of surveying and a lot of complicated stuff that makes it harder to just reach a number and that's it. That's the final answer. But as you point out, the revisions have been getting more and more dramatic over time, to the point where, when you hear a number from the government and it's like, we added this many jobs to the economy, you can't assume that that is actually how many jobs were added to the economy, because you just need to look back through history and notice, like, we keep on changing what the numbers actually are. Now, the reason that is happening is an important one, and it's something that is not being talked about enough, and that is, we are spending way less money on our data collection as a nation. We're actually cutting the amount of resources that we're putting into these data collection agencies. And that is after we've seen a transferal and a transformation into a digital age, where doing all of this stuff, all the numbers are moving a lot faster, and it's actually a lot more difficult to keep track of everything. And so this is the problem, is that you see the numbers are wrong, there's a revision, and then a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, they're lying. It's the woke agenda, or it's the anti-woke agenda, it's the deep state, it's them deciding, it's a psyop, they're trying to trick you. No, they're just bad at collecting data, because they don't have the resources to do it properly, and they don't have the money to do it properly. And the thing that drives me most insane, the thing that this administration is definitely wrong about, is that they have decided that the solution to this problem is to actually remove more resources from agencies like the BLS, because they've decided the BLS is so compromised, it's so rotten to the core, it's part of the deep state, and so we need to just scrap the whole thing altogether, which of course is going to result in even more dramatic revisions, even worse data going forward, and then less faith, less trust in these agencies themselves. And so what we're seeing is the steady decline in the meaning and significance of numbers. which maybe doesn't sound like a big deal on its face, but as we keep watching this story play out, we will begin to see, actually, this is all we've got. All we have is trusting people and their word when they tell us a number. Right to your point about the Wall Street Journal and about Bloomberg, I mean, this is why I get upset when people criticize, and not criticize, but just dunk on media publications and on journalists in general. Oh, it's compromised, fake news, etc. It's like, well, you still read these guys every day, and trust me, you're taking them at their word when they tell you a number. I know plenty of bankers out there who say, I hate all the journalists, I hate all the media people. Well, then stop reading these publications and stop trusting them. But you have to, because it's literally all you've got. I mean, you can look at your Bloomberg terminal, but again, that's part of Bloomberg. That's part of a journalistic institution. So the numbers are actually really important, and also trusting the numbers. I mean, go run your own surveys if you'd like. You're one of the few people who's actually gone out and done that.
Right.
But a lot of these people pretend like they know better than all these people who are. It's like, actually, you don't really know anything. All you have is your faith in these journalists and these institutions. And if you want to find other alternatives, be my guest. And I think that's a good thing to do. But writing it off altogether, that's where we get into big trouble.
I don't know if anybody writes it off altogether. The problem with it is that you can find almost whatever data you want to support whatever point of view it is that you have or what agenda that you have.
Yep.
Last month, and I want to talk about economic sentiment in a second, because that's a topic. Consumer economic sentiment, that's a topic near and dear to our hearts. On January 23rd, the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, which is tried and true, high rigor data source, comes out and says the economic sentiment is up, and their January number is up.
Yep.
A week later, the Conference Board, the other kind of gold standard macroeconomic sentiment measure, came out and said that it had tanked. 4 or 5 days apart from one another. Was one right, one wrong. Actually, they were both right. It was a matter of timing, because in a matter of a week between January 23rd, when the worst of the worst happened in Minneapolis and other things, economic sentiment changed in a matter of a week, and that much of a gap between those two again gold standard organizations showed two completely different pictures of the macroeconomy in January. Both right. Yep. And by the way, both of those numbers were published in the Wall Street Journal. So if somebody's reading that newspaper religiously every single day, they're like, wait a minute, does the consumer think the economy is good or bad? Neither was wrong. But if you wanted to be on Facebook telling your friends to dunk on Trump, look, the economy's tanking according to the consumer, you had one. And if you wanted to say, look, the economy's booming, and you want to celebrate your support of Trump, you could find that too. So that's a big part of the problem, is just there's so much out there. The average person doesn't really understand the nuance. The average person isn't, and I would say not even the average person. I think a lot of people in business, the kind of people that listen to this podcast, don't do the necessary work to triangulate. Right? There isn't one single source of data that should be your go-to at any given time. There should be several of them, and you're looking for the points of consistency across them. But yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. The spiral of institutional distrust that this creates only makes it worse. Mm-hmm. But it does raise the question of, I fully agree. We need to invest in better data collection at the government level to make sure people can, because it's really critical to policymaking. It's critical to the markets. And if we just let it die on the vine, what are we going to have left? So that's absolutely something we have to invest more in. And then otherwise, like in the short term, like, why do we need to put the data out so frequently? Let's do GDP once a year or whatever, or make it, acknowledge that it's a trailing 6-month number, because it does nobody any good other than getting maybe a couple clicks on a headline to put these numbers out when they're half baked.
Yeah. Well, this is the other interesting thing about data, is that yes, it's information, but it's also content. It's also something to read, something to talk about. And figuring out the line between those two things is quite a difficult thing to do. I mean, I am a podcaster. I have a podcast that I publish every single day. And so data for me is also content. I mean, I try to hold a very hard line on, I'm only going to talk about the data that is actually true, that is actually relevant, and that actually matters. I really try to hold myself to that. But I also can't deny that when I see some numbers, when I see the GDP print, when I see the inflation print, that's another thing to talk about. That's another thing to have a conversation about. So I think that there are different things you have to balance there when it comes to the frequency of data. And then ultimately, when it comes to what you should really care about, that sort of depends on who you are.
Right.
I mean, if you are really dead set on understanding how actually is the US doing right now from an economic perspective, going to the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey is a place where a lot of people go, but it's not going to tell you much. Because as you've discussed, and as we've discussed before in our correspondence with each other, the consumer sentiment poll is more of a measure of what you think about politics than what you think about your actual economic situation. And the reason that we know that is because we can look at how sentiment changes based on your political affiliation. When there is a Democrat in power, Republicans think that the economy is doing terribly. And then when there is a Republican in power, Democrats think the economy is doing terribly, and vice versa. And so what we know about that is that is actually a consumer. It's not a measure of how consumers are actually doing. It's more of a measure of how consumers are feeling about the political situation. As you say, what happens in Minnesota and Minneapolis, that didn't really affect the price of anything, but it did affect how people feel about the world, how they feel about America, and how they feel about the administration's handling of all of that. Now, does that mean that the consumer sentiment survey doesn't matter at all? No, it doesn't. It actually matters a lot because it's telling you how people feel, and how people feel actually does matter. How people feel does have an implication on what's going to happen in the political cycle, which does have an implication on what's going to happen potentially to prices. But the question again is, what question are you trying to answer? What are you trying to actually learn when you look at the data? And if you're trying to just get an understanding of, is America good or bad? Is the economy good or bad? I mean, just to begin with, those aren't very good questions, and it's questions that a lot of people try to answer constantly. But you have to pick which things are going to lead you to the right conclusions. And if you don't have the wherewithal to figure that out, well, then you're not going to learn very much at all.
Well, that's why again, back to my point in triangulation, is you need to look at consumer sentiment and consumer spending and sort of in concert with each other. There's the hope that, and there's some signal that shifts in consumer sentiment are early leading indicators of shifts in consumer spending, but it's so nuanced, right?
Right.
I'm probably going to get yelled at for talking about this right now because we have a paper coming out shortly that everyone's really excited about on this very problem. Is one of the fundamental problems with economic sentiment with Michigan and Conference Board and the like, and even ours historically, which we're probably going to change, is that you create your sample frame by matching your universe of respondents to the US Census at a demographic level. So I'm going to have, for every 1,000 people I survey, 510 are going to be women, 490 are going to be men, because that's the ratio of gender in the country. My age buckets are precise. My income buckets are precise. And that's really the important one. So we tend to, and all of us who do this kind of work, have historically mapped our economic sentiment measures to a share of the population based on what we know household income breaks to be across the population, right? There's X under 50,000 in income, there's X between 50 and 75, and we either stratify or weight our data to match those census buckets. But spending isn't working that way right now. And I would argue that what's breaking economic sentiment measures as much as the political influence, which is a relatively 10-year-old phenomenon, it used to not be that way, is the disproportionate amount of spending that's happening in those upper echelons of income groups is offsetting, yes. Right? So we've got a median income of about $80,000 a year in the US. Think about that, right? And not only is it median, but so that, and so we sort of triangulate to that kind of median $80,000 number. But our economy has been the so-called K-shape has been buoyed so much by that upper 10, 5, 1% of spenders that their economic sentiment actually matters more. Now, democratically, it doesn't, but from an economic standpoint, it matters much, much more how that up. And if you look at economic sentiment measures over the last decade, that group looks much more like spending in the economy than the rest of the country. If you're following there, like those are the kinds of things we have to rethink. Is our economy is not democratic any longer. It is wildly skewed in one direction and only becoming increasingly skewed in that direction.
The data point that you're referring to, which was the most important data point that I learned probably last year, and I believe it came out last year, and it came out from a friend of ours on the show, Mark Zandi at Moody's Analytics, is that the top 10% of Americans now make up half of all consumer spending in America, which has never been that high. This is the highest we've ever seen. And what that tells you, and why it's such a big deal, is consumer spending used to be a measure of how America is doing. That's something that people would look at and say, oh, look, consumer spending is up. People are buying stuff. People have money in their pockets. And what that data point told us is that actually consumer spending as a measure of how America is doing is completely compromised, because it's actually only measuring how the top 10% of Americans are doing, because they make up for half of the spending.
Right.
And so now that we know that, suddenly that data point and suddenly that number and all of the questions that we used to think that it answered, suddenly it actually doesn't answer any of those questions anymore. It actually answers a completely different question, which is, how are rich people doing?
Right.
Answer, they're doing pretty well.
Right.
Okay, great. What are we supposed to do with that information now? Does that mean that America's doing fine? No, actually, it means that America's actually probably moving in the wrong direction. It probably means that there are more problems that we need to deal with. And it probably means that actually a lot of people on the lower income are actually doing pretty badly right now because of the discrepancy that we're seeing between the rich, the very, very top, and the poor. So I think it's a really good example of how numbers can be so misleading, how certain questions can be very misleading, and how once you find that one data point that really cracks to the heart of what is actually happening, it can completely shift the paradigm. And my hope, and I think we are starting to see this, is that a lot more people understand that data point. A lot more people understand just how much rich people are actually driving the entire economy, to the point where we're going to be forced to have more nuanced conversations about all of this. Another good example would be GDP. GDP, as a lot of people, many people who listen to this podcast probably would know, GDP went up last year. And it was something that Trump talked about a lot. It's something that he talked about in the State of the Union. It's something that the administration has talked about, the White House has talked about. And it's, again, one of those numbers. I don't remember exactly what the percentage increase was, but it was pretty good. And it's one of those numbers where you go, oh, so everything's going well. Okay, great. Then you learn. And by the way, I should also add that this was a number that Trump was taking credit for. He's saying, because of my policies, this is why the economy is expanding. Then you learn that actually AI is responsible for literally half of that GDP growth. And so you learn that actually this isn't a reflection of the American economy. This is a reflection of the AI economy. This tells you that the biggest, most profitable tech companies are printing boatloads of money by selling their semiconductors and selling their GPU chips to other companies. So those guys are doing really well right now. Yes, we already knew that. Got it. Tech billionaires, Silicon Valley, they're doing well. Understood. So actually, that's what the GDP number is really telling us the full story on. And until you dig into that, you would think that it means that, mechanics in Pittsburgh are doing really well right now. That's not what the number is telling us.
Yeah, that brings you back to, you can find the data point if you want to support your narrative. Particularly if your audience is someone who doesn't know what you're talking about. But the top heaviness of the economy, when we built our economic sentiment index, the hope was that it was going to give us a forward-looking signal of where the economy was going. And when the markets used to react to them, when they were more tethered to actual economic performance, the markets would react to them pretty substantially. Not because it was like a backward-looking indicator, but because that sentiment was believed to be an indicator of where and even the questions that Michigan asks and that we ask are very outlook-based. Do you think the job market's getting better or worse? Do you think the housing market's going to get better or worse? But if our goal is to actually predict actual economic performance, we're going to have to rewire the way we run our survey to oversample those wealthier people because they represent a disproportionate share of the actual economy. And we'll probably end up doing both. But there's another big topic, one other big topic I want to tackle. But before we do that, I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit to our audience. I'm sure a lot of them listen to your podcasts and hopefully read your Substack, which I recommend that they absolutely should. But maybe a little bit about your background, how you got to where you are, maybe where you see it going next. You and I have a lot in common. You were the commencement speaker at your graduating class at Princeton. I barely graduated from a party school in Florida. So maybe we don't have anything in common, but maybe, so you're
more than you'd think.
Yeah. your parents are from the U.S., but you were raised in London, I think. Talk a bit about like how you got to this place. I mean, you've just had a tremendous amount. Recently, one of Forbes 30 under 30 in the U.S. Like, congrats on that. You've just had this like meteoric rise in a place that's hard to kind of stand out. There's so much media out there. Everyone's got a Substack, everyone's got a podcast, and you've risen to the top of that very fast. Talk a little bit about how you did that and maybe what you learned from it and where you see it going from here.
Yeah, so I'm from the UK, hence the accent. My parents are both American, but they moved to the UK before I was born. So I was born in the UK, raised in the UK, have a US passport. So I came back to America for school, went to Princeton, as you say. While I'm at Princeton, I become pretty interested and excited and energized by some of the stuff that was coming out of the mouth of this guy, Scott Galloway. I was listening to his podcast. I was watching his YouTube videos. So I became a Scott Galloway fan. I later learned that one of my roommates, his mother is friends with Scott Galloway. So I do the networky thing immediately.
Good for you.
I say, please, this is my favorite guy. Can you connect me? She says, yes. He takes my call, probably kind of reluctantly, but then we hit it off on the phone. And he says, okay, you can be my intern. So I interned with Scott while I'm studying at school. I did not study economics. I studied classics. I had actually no real economics background, but I was interested in these topics. So I was interning with Scott for a while, and then he says, okay, I'll hire you for a job out of college. So I worked with Scott for a while. I help him figure out his ideas, figure out the podcast, figure out his books and his decks, et cetera, et cetera. And then one day Scott says, about 2 or 3 years into it, I want to start a podcast and I want you to be the newsreader, was what he called it. So my job was to read out the news and then he reacts to it. So that's what I did. I would say the S&P rose by 5% yesterday. This is what happened to gold. Scott, what do you think? And he'd tell me what he thinks. And then eventually I started thinking, okay, maybe I should say my own stuff here. Maybe I should put my own opinions out there. So that's what I did. And it turned into something that people really liked. There was this interesting dynamic between us where I was the young guy who's trying to figure out his place in the world, trying to figure out what's really happening in America. He's the wise older teacher who's telling me how the world works. And I think it was interesting for the audience because we're kind of figuring it out together with Scott as sort of the instructor, as the professor, which is, of course, who he is. So that became more and more popular. And I mean, that's where we are now, which is we've been doing this for about 2 or 3 years. We've, grown it into its own little universe. We used to do this podcast once a week. Now we do it 5 days a week. We're going live on tour. We're going to be in South by Southwest, and then we're going to do we're planning a show in London. Like, it's turned into a whole thing. I mean, the answer to how did I get there, that's how I got there. But the real answer is Scott. I mean, the reason that I get to be where I am today, yes, I put in a lot of work and I work hard and I try to make sure that I understand all of these issues and communicate them in a way that is interesting, relevant, and entertaining to people. But Scott took a gamble on me. He decided, this kid might actually be kind of good at this. And I'm going to put him in front of the camera and I'm going to put him on the mic and see how he does. And that's something that is really rare these days, especially when you look at the way that our society is set up today, where it is more ruled by older people than ever before. If you look at the complexion, the age complexion of Congress, if you even just look at the amount of wealth that is controlled by the older generations, and it's a larger number than ever before, the largest in American history. So the idea for an older guy to say, okay, I'm going to give the young guy a shot and see how he does. And then he does pretty well. And he says, okay, keep doing it. That's something that I really appreciated about what Scott did for me. It's something that's rare. And it is the reason that I'm here speaking with you today.
I mean, look, there aren't many people out there that can point to their success and not attribute it to something or someone like that gave them a break at the right time. I mean, even Scott, and I know he's talked about this, a guy by the name of Bob Lefsetz, who was a guest on this podcast once, I guess shared or retweeted or something, some video of Scott's that he watched, and it helped really accelerate. Not that Scott hadn't done lots of other things to be very successful, but I've heard him even say on, I don't know if it was your podcast or another, credited Bob Lefsetz for sort of his like coming out into the world of media. So like, I think every one of us, I got a dozen people like that I could point to who's, gave me that leg up at one point or a handout or whatever it was when I needed it. So, but you still have to do something with it. So congrats on, rewarding Scott's faith in you. That's awesome. Where do you want to see things go next? So you've got a growing Substack that again, we'll put all this stuff in the show notes, but are you even thinking beyond what's next? Or are you just kind of holding the tiger by the tail that you have right now?
I don't think that far into the future, to be honest with you. I mean, my view is that I'm doing work that is fulfilling and that other people are enjoying. And so my view is I need to keep doing what I'm doing and get better at it. And so as far as I think into the future, it's literally like a year from now. Like, what do I want the podcast to look like? What kind of guests do I want to have on the show? What kind of topics do I want to be tackling? That's as far into the future as I really think. If I were struggling and kind of not knowing what to do and how to sort of put my work out there, then I'd probably be stepping back and be like, okay, what is my 10, 15, 20-year plan here? What am I actually trying to do? And trust me, I've been there.
Yeah.
I've been in that position, and I've literally sat at a whiteboard and been like, okay, what on earth am I supposed to be doing with myself here? At this point, though, because things are going well, we are kind of in a bit of a flow state. My view is I want to be better at my job in terms of I want to understand the issues more and more. I want to communicate them as clearly as possible to the audience. I want to grow the audience. I want Prof G Media to be more and more independent as we grow. That's as far into the future as I really think. So I'm sure it's not a totally satisfying answer to your question, but it's the truth.
No, I think it's exactly the right answer. It's exactly the right answer. Exactly. Again, you've got a lot of great things going on right now. Focusing on that seems to be exactly the right thing to do. All right, I want to shift the gears to a topic that almost nobody's talking about right now. He says facetiously, and that's the subject of AI. This is another thing I know you've written a good bit about. We have some strong opinions about. I think those opinions are pretty well aligned. I'm going to share a couple stats with you. 67% of Americans are somewhat or very concerned about the proliferation of AI tools versus just 18% who are not. The majority of Americans expect AI to have a net negative long-term effect on the quality of their life. Fewer than 1/3 of Americans use an AI tool of any kind on a regular basis. That's for work or for personal use. Fewer than 1/4 use it for shopping. We hear a lot from retailers. They're panicking about this like onslaught of agentic shopping that's coming, but it's barely registering. Only 13%, and I think this is the most important one or one of them, only 13% of people say they mostly or completely trust the information provided to them by Gen AI, 13%. And I'll finish with one more anecdote. I was watching this conversation unfold on Facebook yesterday. A friend of mine, I grew up in very, very red Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania. So my friends from that world I'm close to on Facebook. My one friend was posting about how her electricity bill had gone up and said, is this because of AI data centers? And the general consensus of all of them was that AI is going to destroy the world and AI is evil. That is very much in conflict with the public narratives that we hear about AI, the conversations in the business intelligentsia, the political punditry, what have you. There's a very big disconnect between how much attention AI is getting in the business world and how much it's actually getting, or the negativity that it's getting day to day among normal Americans. What are your thoughts on that discord, and what's causing it, and where do you think it's headed?
Well, I think all of the data that you just mentioned there, that kind of sums up my thoughts. That is, all of the survey data you just mentioned, no one really knows about this. And it's the biggest conversation about AI that no one is having, because everyone's thinking about, okay, what's it going to take to get this AI build out up and running? I mean, how much money are we going to need? Where are we going to get the investment from? Can we get it from the Gulf? Can we make sure that the sovereign wealth funds figure out how to invest in these tech companies? How are we going to figure out the supply chains? What are we going to do about the chips? What are we going to do about the memory chips, which are skyrocketing in demand right now? All of these technical questions about like, what is it going to take to make AI happen? And what are the roadblocks and the obstacles in its way? Those are the questions that people who are leading this industry are asking. Also the questions that people in the administration are asking. The question that no one is asking is, how many people in America actually want this thing? And the answer to that question is way fewer than you think. And also way fewer than previous technologies in the past. If you look, I don't have the numbers right up in front of me, but if you go look at the popularity of the internet and of computers during the internet revolution, people were kind of scared about it, but overall, people were a lot more positive and optimistic about what it would do for their lives than they are about AI today. All of those statistics that you just mentioned are extremely important. The two statistics for me that I've been finding quite striking is, one, that less than a third of Americans trust AI, and two, that less than half of Americans have a favorable view of AI. So it's not popular. People don't like it. And now the question, the response that I would hear from people when I say this to them is, well, I mean, the technology is so powerful, like it's going to happen anyway. People didn't like farming tools and technology when it first came out. People didn't necessarily like the internet. People didn't like machinery. I mean, this is sort of the Luddite argument that not everyone liked it. Okay. But have we ever seen such a vast plurality of people who don't like this technology so passionately? And have we ever seen this many people rally against that technology in such an organized fashion? And the answer is actually no. And what we're now starting to see is that anti-data center activist groups are popping up all around the country. The last I saw, there are more than 140 anti-data center activist groups across the US in 24 different states. They have blocked $64 billion worth of data centers in just 2 years. So this is actually a real problem for the AI builders. And that is, their product is extremely unpopular. And so I think there's an argument to be made that, you know, maybe America has it wrong. Maybe the American public shouldn't hate AI as much as they apparently do. But if that is the case, then you need to go out and fight against that argument. You're not going to get this done by simply forcing AI into our lives, forcing the data centers wherever you want to put them. You will get revolts. You will get pushback because of how much people are worried about this thing. So you need to make the argument that this is actually a good thing. And that is an argument that no one seems equipped to make. You need to show us, actually, this is not going to take your job. And the reason it's not going to take your job is because, for example, we have worked with the government. We have designed actual legislation that is going to protect you for these reasons. We have figured out a policy response, such as maybe a worker retraining program or a worker reinvestment fund, or maybe even universal basic income, which you'll remember, this was what Andrew Yang literally talked about 5 years ago. This was the entire premise of his campaign, that robots and AI are going to replace us, and therefore we need to figure out a way to pay Americans to soften that transition. This was literally his entire campaign, and now it's exactly playing out as he predicted. So you need to show us that this is going to happen, because we have to be quite frank with you. You told us that AI isn't going to replace us, and yet Amazon just laid off 15,000 people. They said it's because of AI. Block, previously known as Square, just laid off 4,000 people. That's literally half of their workforce. They said it is because of AI. We saw the same thing at Pinterest. We're seeing the same thing all over the place. So AI actually is taking your job. You've literally told us as much. So what are you going to do about that now? And that is the question that people need to start answering.
The problem, though, Ed, and is the people in power, whether that's the power of business or the power of government, and this is going to sound really, really cynical, because I think many of them, some of whom listen to this very podcast, would be offended to hear me say this, but I don't think the majority of them really care. And part of it is, I just wrote about this weekend, and it's actually reminded me of something that I saw that you'd written or talked about. It was the sort of the death of the death of centralized conversation, and that's it's a slightly different spin on the same thing that I'm pointing out, which is there are a lot of things that Americans widely agree on. Widely, like 70 plus 5 plus 70, almost 80% things we agree on. Getting corporate money out of politics, ending the gerrymander, age gating of social media. There are lots of things that across party lines, 75 to 85% of Americans, there's no action being taken on any of those things, and there's hardly any political discourse about them whatsoever. Why? Because there's no central place that people are able to talk about those things, because it's so much easier to create a bunch of smaller conversations about more divisive things where there's a winner and a loser than it is to talk about the big things that everyone agrees on. And because of that, like the collective voice of our population has just got more and more and more muted, because there's no collective voice being created. And this is just another one of those things. The vast majority of Americans are freaking out about AI, and either the powers that be aren't aware of it, or they're aware of it and they don't care, because there is no effort being undertaken to educate people on either, hey, no, there's actually really good things here you aren't seeing, or yes, we acknowledge there's bad things and here's what we're going to do about it. I don't know what the possible solution to that problem is. And I don't know why. Do you have any thoughts on why AI, unlike all of those other innovations, is getting this kind of reception?
There's a lot in there. The first thing I would say is the one thing that we have in terms of centralizing the conversation, because the point that you're making, which is right, the thing I wrote about, is there are so many different platforms at this point where people are having completely disparate conversations. And I realized this because I wanted to talk about a topic on my podcast, which I realized I had read about only on Twitter or X. And I thought that everyone was going to know what I was talking about. And then I realized, oh, wait, only a small percentage of the population actually goes on this platform. So actually, they probably don't know about this topic. So we're all having all of these different conversations, and no one really knows how to get on the same page with one another. We don't know on which things we agree or disagree. But that's where survey data is essential, because the survey data will actually go out and count it all up and find out, actually, yeah, the majority of people do not like AI. And that is something that you cannot disagree with. You could be someone in Congress and say, no, I had a conversation with my grandma. She said that actually AI is great. Well, no, we just counted up the numbers. And this is something that the majority of Americans actually do agree on this point. So that's where you have to lead with these conversations. You have to be like, look, we polled the people. Here's what they're saying. So why is the reception to AI so negative? I think that it's a few things. One, the job thing is very real. And I got to be honest, we were lied to about this job displacement thing. The amount of money and PR that was poured into by these AI companies to try to convince us that AI wouldn't replace us, it would work with us, was gigantic. And it was actually quite a compelling narrative that most of us kind of went along with, I would say about a year, maybe 18 months ago. Now that we're starting to see the layoffs roll in, exactly what you would expect if AI were going to replace a lot of jobs, that is what is happening on the ground right now. So we no longer really believe that. So that's a big part of it. The job displacement is going to be huge. And to be frank, they weren't very honest with us. I think the other problem here is the concentration of power among these technology companies, which wasn't really so in your face during the internet revolution. I mean, you didn't have this level of wealth inequality that you have in America today, where the top 19 households own 2% of all household wealth. It's literally 20x in the past 40 years. And I think that people are starting to connect the dots here. They're realizing the immense amount of wealth that has been created in a handful of tech companies. They're realizing just how top heavy the S&P has become, where the S&P 10 is making up a larger proportion, a larger weighting of the entire S&P 500 than ever before. And they're realizing, actually, we have a lot of reason to not like the guys who want this to be a success. These guys have taken control of our politics after Citizens United. They've invested billions of dollars into our political campaigns. They have steered the trajectory of this country. And so the thing that they're building and want to profit off of, we're not super down for that. And that's just a general sentiment. So I think that that is another piece of it that, again, the people who run these tech companies can just say, we don't care. Or you can try to figure out a way to genuinely contend with that. I think eventually they're going to have to, because of how much pushback we're starting to see.
That's a very concise explanation for why that. And look, I have a friend of mine who said, if we thought we've seen a populist movement in the last 10 years, wait till we see the next 10 years.
That's right. Look back 300 years ago. Go to France. Go to revolutionary France. That's what a populist movement looks like. We've seen it many times before. Right. We saw the peasant revolt in Germany. We saw what happened in Russia. I mean, if you're worried about a 5% wealth tax, you've got bigger fish to fry here. Right. This is going to get a lot worse. Right.
Well, let's transition to some lighter topics on our way out. Yeah, I mean, look, and by the way, like I never go into these conversations knowing what the theme is necessarily. I know what some topics are going to be, but like what I'm going to title it or whatever, and I don't think until I heard you talk, I really appreciate it. I think that there's some cohesion between this talk about economic data and this talk about AI, which is just the general sense of discord, the lack of trusted information that's out there, the lack of centralized kind of ground truth, whether it's about how the economy is doing or what AI is going to do, which, by the way, those two things are super tightly knit. So I kind of like how those two things tied together. So I've got a handful of poll questions for you that we're both going to answer and compare ourselves to the rest of our country on. Easy one. Do you consider yourself an early adopter when it comes to technology?
Yes.
See, I don't. I'm like the second. I kind of wait for at least one. I have my very early adopter friends who do it first, and then I'm kind of the next one, right?
Now you're making me doubt myself, because there are those very, very early adopters where it's almost their entire identity.
Yes.
And they have to be there first. Right. I'm not quite that.
Yeah, right. I think and I guess it's all relative. My mom would say I'm a tech early adopter, but only, but there's 3-4 people behind me. Actually, very few people really about 34% of Americans consider themselves a little bit of an early adopter, but it's only like 8%. I think that's the ones we're talking about, the real hardcore early adopter.
Yes. This reminds me of that survey question on, are you a good driver? 80% of Americans say that they are an above average driver. I was thinking that maybe 70% of Americans were going to say, oh yeah, I'm an early adopter.
Yes. One of my favorite questions we run is, do you consider yourself to be more or less physically attractive than most people your age and gender? And it's just fascinating. It's fascinating how people answer it. Do you plan on attending any major musical festivals this year? Are you a concert goer, music goer?
I used to be. I'm realizing the answer to that question is no. I'm actually not a huge fan of music festivals.
Me neither.
At this point.
I like a concert. The festival, I feel like I've outgrown it. I feel like
festivals that it's too much. There's too much going on. It gets dirty. It gets like you lose people. You're trying to figure out where your group is. Yeah, I'm actually.
And I can't do the drugs I used to do to get through them, like be able to tolerate them any longer. So that's maybe the part of the problem. How prepared are you to host guests in your home at any given time?
Very prepared. Love hosting guests. Makes me feel good about myself, to be honest. I like being welcoming and having stuff to provide for them.
Somebody showed up impromptu at your house. You could turn it on in a second.
That's a little bit of a different thing, because I might be kind of annoyed that they're being disrespectful.
Well, no, it's like somebody you're excited to see. Do you have the beer?
Sure.
Do you have the beer and wine there, and you've got the guest bed made, and like
100%. Have the guest bed, have it made, have the sheets, the towels ready. Big fan of that.
Yeah, us too. Only 16% of Americans consider themselves very prepared to host a guest at their home at any given time. The plurality is not prepared at all. How confident are you in your ability to complete basic home repairs?
I'm getting there. I would say semi-confident.
That's 38%. That's the most popular answer.
What about you?
So I said semi-confident. I wrote about this actually a couple of weeks ago, and then my wife read it, and she said, "Oh yeah, I have a list of things for you to do." And I was like, "Oh yeah." Well, first of all, shit, I don't.
Checkmate.
Yeah, checkmate. Like that. It's another one of those things where I know people who are really, really good at like fixing everything handy, and then I'm so far from that. I'm probably a 4 out of 10, maybe.
10. I think that's probably right for me too.
Yeah. I would aspire to be. All right. Last but not least, I loved this question. Do you ever feel judged by bartenders when ordering a drink?
I don't think I care that much. I actually don't. It hasn't really crossed my mind. I'm going to say no.
So surprisingly, a third of people say that they feel judged based on their drink order. Yeah.
Yeah.
My answer is completely different than yours. I care so much about it that I think about it before I order my drink. Like depending on the vibe of the place and I don't know why. It's just my own kind of narcissism or self-consciousness of like, if I, there's certain drinks that I would like to drink, but I'm not going to order that here because this bartender in his overalls and bow tie is going to look down his nose at me. So I'm not going to do it.
Right. So you're saying, so maybe you're at like a fancy place and you just want a beer and you're worried about that, or the other way around.
Yeah. I don't know. Or yeah, maybe. Or if I'm like at like a fancy, bourbon place and I really just want like a Moscow Mule or something and don't want to go down whatever. I don't know. But I do sort of think about like the social acceptance of whatever or drink. And I'm not saying that's a point. I'm saying that from that's not a strength by any means, but I am self-conscious about that stuff. So I think about it. Well, good to end on a couple fun notes. Look, Ed, first of all, thank you so much for making the time. Congrats on just the rocket ship you're on. It's so cool to watch. I've been listening to Prof G, I guess probably around since the time it started. And I remember when you were the newsreader and watching how that has evolved, and you've earned every single inch of it. And you're obviously lucky to have found someone that's put that kind of support behind you, but you've earned every bit of it. Yeah. I mean, we talked about some really big, heavy things today. It's going to be a crazy next kind of 1 to 5 years to see how it unfolds. So thanks for joining me, Ed. And let's, anything we can do to help and support you. We're always here and just got data on just about everything you'd ever need. So I hope we'll stay in touch.
Well, thank you. And I will continue to use your data, which I use all the time. And the timeliness point that you said at the very top is a very big one. Sometimes I'll go to Pew or I'll go to Gallup because I want to understand something at sort of a general level. But as soon as I need something that is time sensitive, I go to you guys, say, what do people think of this? And then you guys immediately have the answer. And not only that, you have historical data going back months, years, and I can actually see the progression of how things have changed. So I appreciate you guys and I appreciate all the work you're doing too.
All right. Well, good luck and hope to see you in person one of these days.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.